Hello, everyone. I'm Ellen Troxclair, Senior Fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and former Austin City Council member. And thank you for joining us today for this session on Priced Out, Austin's growing affordability crisis. As we all know, any of us who are living in Austin know that the cost of living has absolutely skyrocketed over the past several years. Up until the passage of Senate Bill 2 last session, we've been on track to double property taxes every 9 years, a bottleneck of supply and demand and people moving to our wonderful city of Austin has caused sales prices to increase. And ultimately, we're looking at each other saying and thinking, are we going to be able to afford to continue to live here? We have some amazing experts on this panel today. So please help me welcome Jeff Tucker. He's an economist at Zillow. And at Zillow, they use data to tell the story of the housing market. They have access to incredible data, not just on Austin, but on how Austin is comparing to the rest of the country and what are trends looking like as we look into the next couple of years. Next, we have Geoffrey Tahuahua, the Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs at RECA, the Real Estate Council of Austin. This is a major organization, commercial development association. They have, I think he said 17,000 members or something crazy like that span all kinds of commercial development aspects. And so he also has a unique insight into what's going on in Austin. And last but not least, we are joined by James Quintero, who is the policy director at Government for the People campaign, otherwise known as my boss. James, thank you. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm excited to get started. In my spare time, I'm also a residential real estate agent. So this is a topic that is also near and dear to my heart, and something that I'm struggling with clients as we try to find them a home to live in and around Austin. Jeff, why don't you kind of set the stage for us? What does the market look like in Austin right now, and what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. The market in Austin is incredibly hot. The housing market is incredibly hot. That's being driven by primarily migration. Austin is a magnet for domestic migration inside the US. It has been for several years. It was the fastest growing metro among the top 35 in the last decade. It grew almost 30% from 2010 to 2019, according to the census. We're about to find out how much in 2020. That's just staggering. So on the one hand, that sort of reflects the fact that Austin has done a pretty good job at building more homes for people who want to move there. Certainly a much better job than most major coastal metros that had a big demand shock in the last generation, say San Francisco. I'd say here in Seattle, where I live, we've done better than San Francisco at welcoming new people by building more homes for them, but nowhere near as good a job as Austin has done. Nonetheless, building homes takes time. It takes time, it takes land, materials, labor. So when you have a big demand shock, it's hard to keep up with demand by building more homes. It's not like downloading more apps where you can get millions more overnight. So that struggle to kind of keep up with demand is reflected in prices. So sort of by the numbers here, Austin is in the top 3 metro areas nationwide when we look at home price appreciation. At Zillow, we build that actually off the Zestimate. So you probably know your own home Zestimate. That was Zillow's kind of original claim to fame. So we take that and add it all up for metro areas and compare them. Happily, other sources like Case-Shiller tend to tell a very similar story. So what we're seeing is annual appreciation of about 13% in Austin, which is insane. It should not be double-digit price growth year over year. That shouldn't happen, but it has just gone up like a hockey stick, and that's not coming off of like a soft period. Seattle is also in there in the top 3 for price appreciation, but that's actually because we were really soft in 2019, back when interest rates were higher. Austin is sort of having strength building on strength when it comes to prices. It has been among the fastest growers for a while. And so now at this point, another way of kind of looking at it is just that Austin has moved from one world of rather affordable metro areas, and it's rapidly moving into this zone of pretty unaffordable metro areas. One way of thinking of that is nationwide, and actually in many parts of the country, we are not that far off from where we were at the peak of the mid 2000s home price boom. Whereas in Austin, prices are 72% higher than they were at the peak back in 2005 and 2006. So it is just like a phase shift, going from a fairly affordable middle-class place where middle-class families can afford to buy a family-sized home. And it's looking like that world is kind of being left in the rearview mirror. So I think that's sort of the state of play at the moment. And, it's tempting to sort of think that this 2020 was just some sort of anomaly, but I guess what I would say is it was accelerating trends that were underway. And if anything, the rise of remote work is kind of freeing up even more people to move away from very expensive coastal areas. And they're still sort of working through those decisions. If they want to work remotely and have an affordable family-sized home in Austin, but their job is in San Francisco, there's a lot of people who are still probably yet to make that move.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm a little bit shocked to hear you say that Austin has done a good job of keeping up with supply, because from our perspective here, we've had a lot of stops and starts with the rewrite of the land development code that would allow for more housing to be built on some of those corridors. That's been a major source of kind of community discussion for several years now. We have one of the least dense kind of central downtown areas, and we have a lot of neighborhoods, historic neighborhoods like Tarrytown, Pemberton, that are low density single family homes. And I know that Geoffrey has been kind of in the middle of all of these discussions in his role at RECA, and of course has been very involved in the city council decisions. Geoffrey, can you kind of walk us through what really impacts the supply side of the scale? We understand, I mean, there is no question that there's more demand for housing as people are kind of migrating from blue states to red states. But how has the Austin City Council kind of managed that demand for additional housing?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. And yeah, I do have to disagree a little bit with Jeff. I think we definitely, we've tried to manage it. We've done, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, a very poor job at managing that. And I think it's important to understand that our land development code, which is kind of the guidebook or the building block of how we develop our city, was last updated in the 1980s. And since then, it has been amended over 500 times. And it's kind of been a piecemeal approach since that start. And what that's brought us to is really, 13 departments at the city of Austin and over 500 employees who are involved in the process. And each one of those either entities or persons has the ability to say no. And so we've sort of overly complicated what should be a fairly simple process. My people, our developer members and our home builder members tell us all the time that, we are more than happy to play by the rules. Just tell us what they are and what's required of us, and we'll play by them. But more often than not, you go to departments and with your application, and one department will tell you one thing and the other one will tell you another thing. I'll never forget, I was talking with somebody who was going to be helping with us on a project at the state legislature. And she told us that she had been working on a porch in her extension in her backyard for over 2 years. And it required an engineer and an architect, as well as some pretty hefty design plans in order for them to get through the process for what should have been, a pretty simple, maybe 3-4 month process, because she was adding a extended roof over it, which is kind of what complicated. But yeah, we unnecessarily overly complicate the process here, and that's a huge impact. And what I tell people all the time is, it doesn't matter whether you're a high-rise developer or you're just, wanting to add an accessory dwelling into your home. It is just as complicated for every single person. And to your point, with the neighborhoods, it's a constant challenge that we face here, in that you have people who live in an existing neighborhood who fight every single development that comes up, and in some cases fight development that is not even near them. It's 10, 15, 12 miles away, and that adds to the cost, because it adds to the time. And council, I think, is constantly arguing amongst themselves as to how best to manage it, and no one has sort of figured out the single best approach. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the big challenges, and the reason why I think we're here, because it's just been a constant strain on the supply, and so we really can't crank out fast enough.
Yeah, well, I experienced that personally as we just finished a home renovation and a bit of an addition ourselves, and ended up being an extremely lengthy process, which I kind of expected going in, knowing my background on the Austin City Council. I knew that there were going to be a lot of hoops to jump through, but it was interesting to experience it firsthand, and I can share those stories offline another time. But I can attest to the fact that it is, whether you're trying to add a porch or a bathroom or a guest home for your aging parents, or whether you're trying to build an apartment complex, the levels and levels of hoops that you need to jump through, and the approvals that you need to get, and the number of people who can reverse the decision of the previous approval is really staggering. And I think that really came to a clear fruition in a comparison that was done between building an apartment complex in Austin versus building an apartment complex in Dallas. It was the same project, and there were, the same builder, same kind of estimates, and ultimately the very same project in Austin was over $100,000 more than it costs to build in Dallas. And that was simply because the length and the expense required for the city of Austin permitting processes. So I'll look forward to circling back to you, Geoffrey, to talk more about kind of what are the requirements. I mean, people's eyes glaze over, I think, when we talk about a rewrite of the land development code, but what is it really in there that is restricting that development? The minimum lot sizes and parking restrictions and things like that. But first, I want to get James's input on kind of the tax side of things, and how have taxes grown maybe over the past few years or so? What are the projections going forward, and how has this growing tax burden really impacted the culture and the face of the Austin community?
Well, thanks, Ellen. It's always a pleasure to be on with you. And just as a general rule, anytime Ellen gives you an open invitation to have offline conversations about the Austin City Council, always take it. So when it comes to the tax, well, let's start here. The affordability question, the problem here is multifaceted, and unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. But the tax element is one important piece of the equation. And when you look at it, it's very clearly out of control. So, using the Travis County's own data, what we find is that the average Travis County homeowner is going to pay about $9,000 in property taxes this year. Now, that's going to include a fairly sizable portion to Austin ISD. In fact, about half of that is going to go to Austin ISD. About 40% is going to go to the city of Austin and Travis County itself, and the remaining 10% out to various special districts. But about $9,000 in taxes this year. It's probably between $750 and $800 per month for the average homeowner. Now, when you look back just a few years ago, what you see is that in 2015, that was about 65% lower than the current amount. So the average taxpayer in 2015 paid $5,400 in taxes to all the various jurisdictions. So again, that's about a 64% increase from 15 to the current year. It suggests very significant growth. Now, one curiosity, at least in my mind, is that we have had an influx of new people and new money to the area. And so, I think some of that growth is perhaps warranted, but is a 64% increase in line with population and inflation? I don't think so. And to back up that statement, what we did in a recent document is we went through the top 10 most populous cities counties, and school districts. And what we wanted to do was measure the growth of taxes versus population and inflation growth. And what we found in not just in Austin, but really everywhere, was that taxes were growing at a much faster rate than what we are comfortable with. And I just want to read you a few stats and bore you with a few numbers. And what we found, again, this is how fast taxes grew from 14 to 18 and versus population and inflation over the same period. So in the city of Austin, taxes grew by 41%. Population and inflation increased over that same period by just 13%. In Travis County, it was a little bit more reasonable. We saw a 22% growth in the tax levy over that period. Population and inflation increased by 14%. In AISD, this was the big one. And of course, this again accounts for about half of your tax bill. Property taxes increased by 56% over that period. Enrollment and inflation only increased 0.7%, right? What that tells me is that the tax burden is growing at such a rate that we're forcing families in the downtown core and in the surrounding areas out to cheaper ground, so to speak, just like my family did. We're fleeing Austin because we can't afford the taxes anymore. So again, taxes are just one element of it, but it is an important part, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really, we're kind of getting the perfect storm and a triple whammy, because we have the people moving to Austin from higher tax, bluer cities and states. We have the Austin City Council kind of being hesitant to really update their land development code and to make sure that we have enough supply to sell, to house these newcomers and people whose needs are changing, who are already living in Austin. And on top of that, we're dealing with just a crushing debt burden that I hope will relax with some of the efforts that you've been heading up at the state level, James. But we've with COVID going on, we have yet to see kind of the fruits of those labors and the good legislation that was passed last session. I want to circle back to Jeff. How we sitting in Austin look at San Francisco and say, nope, like we don't want to do that. We don't want to be there. We don't want the $1 million median price. For a tiny, 2-bedroom, whatever it is, that's not family friendly and not affordable. We certainly don't want the tax burden. We want a more efficient city government. I mean, I could go on and on, but it seems like regardless of whatever side of the aisle you're on, we all agree, those of us living in Austin, that we don't want Austin to become the next San Francisco. But it seems like we are maybe on that path. And what is really worrying me is that we're not only seeing the supply tighten in central Austin. In fact, I think that there's the condo market is kind of loosening a little bit as people move out of the city center because of the homeless issues and other things that the city council has brought on. But even in the suburbs, I mean, even in the Pflugervilles, the Georgetowns, the Buda, the Kyle, in the surrounding kind of suburban communities, we're seeing demand and prices skyrocket there as well. So are we on the path to becoming the next San Francisco?
You're at least on the path to becoming the next Seattle, I would say. And these discussions of a zoning rewrite or rethink and trying to figure out how to make more efficient use of the space you have and the infrastructure you have. You split a lot, you put another house in the back half. I actually live in a split lot myself. I love it. It's the only reason I could afford the neighborhood I live in. And it's plenty of yard for our dogs. But you make more efficient use of the space that you have, then you don't need as much tax burden to maintain things. It's the same amount of street frontage, whether or not you've got the lots split, whether or not you've got 10,000 square foot lots or 5,000 or 2,000 square foot lots, but you have more taxpayers who can share the burden of maintaining that road, for instance. It's absolutely right that Austin is now experiencing this kind of radiating outward of demand. We see it in the Seattle region too. A lot of people moving out toward Tacoma, more affordable suburbs. And I just sort of checked out a zip code level map of the Austin area. The same thing is happening. When I look out north toward Pflugerville or Leander or Cedar Park, we're seeing 20% price growth instead of 13%. So it's those communities are changing really quickly. And I think that's a reminder that the metro area is a unified labor market and therefore a pretty unified housing market. That means you could be living on your comfortable ranch home on a big lot out in the suburbs and may think, whatever Austin's doing doesn't concern me, but it's all connected. So if, these young families in Austin can't afford to stay there and raise their family there, they're going to come out, they're going to be bidding up prices further out. Everyone's looking for their own space. And so since it's all connected, you need some regional coordination and cooperation to come up with a plan for how to continue to sort of gracefully grow and accept that rising demand. And I appreciate the pushback from all of you about this idea of how well Austin has done keeping up with demand. I think that takeaway of being in the two or three fastest growing metro areas in the country for years on end now, well, the proof is in the pudding. If that happens, it means effectively you have not successfully kept up with demand. So you really need this kind of regional cooperation. Otherwise, certainly, Austin's problems become all of Travis County's problems and even further out.
So from your perspective, then are we anticipating that this is going to continue for the foreseeable future? It's a little bit of a double-edged sword for homeowners in particular, because it's great that your home, maybe you have $100,000 more in equity than you did in your home last year. But the flip side of it is that that's not actually cash in your pocket, and you're having to pay the property taxes on a property that you bought, for a much lower value that's now really skyrocketed. So I think there's a little bit of a cash flow issue. It's great that your house is worth more, but how are you going to pay the taxes in the meantime? And if you want to cash out, where are you going to go? It used to be, we can leave Travis Heights and move to Buda, but that is no longer the case. You can do it, but you're going to have equally high prices kind of in the suburbs as well. So from your national perspective, do you think that this trend is going to continue? And what can we do? What are some solutions? Like what is your advice for either the Austin City Council or for the regional area to kind of stem the incredible increase?
Well, we actually just ran a survey of over 100 real estate economists around the country and asked them, out of all these major metros in the country, who do you expect to have prices grow faster than the national average? Austin was at the top of that list. So there is a consensus out there that this trend is continuing, that the rise in demand, the continuing migration to attractive Sunbelt cities, and Austin's picking up even more buzz in the tech scene on the West Coast as a place to either relocate your company or open up new offices and expand employment. So I think the coming demand is pretty much set in stone. Okay, making predictions is hard, especially about the future, they always say, but I think you can count on demand continuing to come. So the best bet is to find ways to increase supply. That means getting out of the way of home builders of all kinds. Whether they're building, a new subdivision, whether they're trying to add townhouses or splitting lots, some infill in Austin itself. There was a great study by the Mercatus Center that looked at minimum lot sizes around different metro areas in Texas. And they found that in the Austin area, basically they found that minimum lot sizes were binding in many cases. If you sort of look at the distribution of how big lots tend to be, they got really bunched up at each local jurisdiction's minimum size, meaning the developers aren't actually slicing up the land according to what consumers want and what they think would be most efficient to build. They're trying to sort of shrink it and actually get more homes into a neighborhood, basically, but regulations getting in the way. They're running into that minimum lot size, and that's forcing them to make fewer homes on any given piece of land. So if I were looking around at regulations that have been shown to decrease the supply of housing, that one is a slam dunk. That is clearly decreasing the supply of housing on any given piece of land. I think the policy realm is also where Geoffrey here shines on this call. So I'm really curious to hear what his top priorities would be.
Yeah, Geoffrey, that's a perfect segue into what your perspective is there at RECA. Of course, again, we've been in many years of discussions about rewrites to the land development code. I think the city has done, there is no question that we have a supply and demand issue. And it's kind of boiled down to really a messaging problem. I think that the city really bungled the first go at it, and, spent $8 million, paid a consultant $8 million to come up with a great plan. And ultimately there was so much pushback from the kind of more historic Central Austin communities. They were scared of, well, is there going to be an apartment complex in the backyard? How is this going to impact my property values? And there was so much misinformation and confusion that they literally would be better off taking that $8 million and lighting it on fire, because they threw it all in the trash. So now it seems like a reboot of those efforts has still not really been successful. And I'm starting to wonder if anything is really going to happen, because I certainly understand, if I am a homeowner in Hyde Park and I bought in that neighborhood because of its historic charm, and because it's low density and et cetera, I understand that you want to preserve that neighborhood character. On the other hand, are there pockets of the city that are more kind of high density corridors that are really designed for kind of more live, work, retail spaces, retail on the bottom or stores on the bottom with apartments up top that are along Lamar or South Congress or places that are already kind of experiencing heavy traffic, things like that. So what is your outlook on where we stand with that and increasing the supply? And can you dig into a little bit more of what the details are of these limited, the minimum lot requirements in Austin and the parking requirements, the things that are really kind of restricting the builder's ability to get more housing on the ground?
Sure. Yeah. And going back to the code, I think, part of the complexity is it just in the fact of how massive our code actually is. It's actually at the moment in several different pieces, and part of the attempt to try and fix it was to kind of put it all in one thing. And when you put it all in one thing, it's literally a special order binder that's over 1,100 pages long, double-sided. I think we paid like $75 for each of these, for a couple copies when we were going through that process. And so one of your
claims to fame is that you've read every page, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm one of the 4 people who's actually read it. But yeah, when you start off with something that complicated, just being able to untangle that mess in itself is a nightmare. And to your point, we talk a lot about minimum lot sizes. And I think that's a really important thing, because when Austin was designed, and over the years we kind of have sort of a hodgepodge. So at the moment you actually have a bunch of really small lots that exist in some of these historical neighborhoods, but they're considered non-conforming, and so you functionally, if you want to do something with them, you can't, and so you end up having to buy another smaller lot to then combine it so you can meet the minimum requirements. And then if you want to be creative, you have to kind of go around in circles to do it. One of the things you could do is, if you're one of the fortunate few who can find like a 10,000 square foot lot, you could put 2 houses on there. And essentially what you have to do is you have to do a condo regime between the 2 houses. And so that's hiring lawyers and figuring out an agreement. And, then, you have to make sure ultimately whoever ends up buying those houses is going to have to really get along with their neighbor, because they're going to share a water meter and do all kinds of things like that. Whereas in places like Baltimore, where these row home type neighborhoods have existed for years, you literally have homes on 0 lot lines where they have their own utilities, they have their own meters, and it's structured that way, and everyone's okay with it, and everyone likes it. And so, when you restrict it that much off the front of the gate, and you have all this demand, it forces people to have to be creative. And one of the things I always emphasize when I'm talking to government officials or people doing reviews is that when you're doing regulations, you need to make it as easy as possible to be innovative and to encourage the solutions you want to see happen. if you make it as hard as possible to do certain things, it's not going to stop people from doing it. They're just going to find a different way to do it. And what usually that means, it means they're going to have to hire lawyers, engineers, or special people to help try and find ways to work through these regulations. And that ends up adding cost. And, in the land development code, we really did try to work through those minimum lot size. And there were really, the zoning section was a huge improvement. But to your point, Ellen, there was a really bad messaging on the part of the city's effort to explain to people. And again, a lot of the people who opposed it, and as I talked to many of them, none of them had ever read the code. So none of them understood, what was actually happening there. I had one person who thought that, they lived in a neighborhood kind of south of the river, and they were probably about 6 blocks from Main Street, Lamar. And they thought that there was going to be like a 7-story, apartment building right next door to the house. It's like, no, like it's not going to happen. Now, if you're a house that still happens to exist on Lamar, yeah, there is going to be some change that you're going to see and witness. And if you're the property immediately behind that, there's also going to be some change. But if you're 6, 7, 8 blocks in, it's not going to be that different. And I think that's something that as a community we need to start understanding, is that, just because there's some change happening on that main road, the main corridors, doesn't mean we need to fight them every single time. I'll never forget, there's a really great affordable housing provider here in town, Foundations Communities. They do awesome work, all privately funded for the most part. And they were building a development on Lamar, and they were building it as a condo with some like retail. And what's cool about their stuff is they put a bunch of services in their ground floors for their tenants. And there was a property owner about 2 blocks behind them, and they filed an appeal to the building permit to a board called the Board of Adjustment. And that ultimately ended up getting appealed, that decision, to then district court. And so then Foundations Communities had to go hire a lawyer and fight this particular neighbor just because they didn't like the fact that there was going to be, quote, like a high rise. I mean, I think it's 55 feet. So on Lamar, that's not very tall, but and to that developer as an affordable housing provider, that money that they had to spend on a lawyer means fewer units that they can either put in that development or put in another development. And so that's a challenge that we continue to see. Parking requirements, which is the other thing you mentioned, is a real interesting one. We actually had, Rika had the position that you should actually get rid of parking requirements altogether. And that tends to freak out a lot of people, but what a lot of people don't realize is that parking is usually tied very heavily to your use. And a lot of banks tend to look at that and look at your parking, like what you're planning to park, as a reason to finance you or to not. So what a lot of people don't know is that as long as the market still wants parking, you're still going to have parking. But what Austin does is they sort of artificially set this requirement on sites that has no real math or science behind it. It's just an artificial number. And so we have a tendency to overpark, especially in downtown. Believe it or not, I believe it was like 2-3 years ago, Downtown Alliance said something that there's actually enough parking for every single person in downtown Austin who wants to drive a car. The problem is that we don't utilize those parking spaces efficiently yet. And again, going back to the city's regulations don't really allow you to utilize that. Minneapolis is kind of an interesting place because a lot of their parking garages and access between buildings is done through these like glass halls that exist on the second floor, because when it snows, that's the only way you can make it around town. And so their code is designed to make all of those public uses. And then there's no, there's sort of an accepted, like, you're not liable for things, even though it's because it's a public space at that point. And so our code doesn't, think of those things. And so we'll force people to artificially park. And then the other, as you start piling on everything else, it just adds to it. A lot of people say, well, man, I really wish that you could put parking garages underground in downtown Austin, because I really don't like, driving on all these streets and seeing all these parking garages. Most people don't know is that because of our city's drainage requirements and detention requirements, quite frankly, because of the city's inability to maintain that infrastructure and to keep up with that infrastructure over the years, we're having to do it. And the city says, well, we don't want that, above ground. So we're forced to dig, sometimes 3-4 story hole for drainage. And then we put the parking garage on top of that. Independent is probably a great example because their entire parking garage is above ground, and they have a detention pond and water quality pond essentially under the building that no one will ever see unless you're one of the unfortunate people who has to maintain those. But that's part of what we have to do. And so, yeah, it's how all of these things add together that makes it complex. And that's why, my organization, we push really hard about trying to make improvements to the process. And the way I always put it is, if any success we have in improving the process, whether you're that high-rise developer, an apartment person, or you're just trying to add that extra 300 square foot room so grandma can move into the house, it should make the process easier. And that should be the goal that we're all working towards. But unfortunately, it's a pretty big challenge when you're dealing with a city this big.
Sorry, I muted myself because my dog was barking in the background. You mentioned a couple of the big holdups, especially for commercial developers downtown, but the person who just wants a place for their grandma to build or whatever, the things that the city, the little things, oh, well, it's only an extra $1,500 to require that every new home is solar panel ready. So that regardless of whether or not they're going to actually use solar panels, you have to have the builder install the equipment so that they can at a point in later time. Well, it's only $1,500. It's only $1,000 here. It's only $750 here. Screens. They wanted to require that every home had screens on their windows, which, okay, I don't know how much screens cost these days. You can probably get them for cheap, but how does that impact the person in East Austin who has been there for generations and they're already putting all the cash they have out of their pocket into their property tax bill, right? They don't want to be told by the Austin City Council that they have to go retrofit their house or add screens to something that they've been living in just fine for the past 30 years. And then what happens as those multi-generational families keep growing? The code generally in most parts of our city prohibit somebody from building a back house or building a guest house. And so anyway, where do we stand? Just quickly, Geoffrey, can you tell us where do we stand? Where does Austin stand with that, with the rewrite development code? What is the process now going forward?
Sure. Yeah, I'll touch on that, and I'll sort of briefly answer your question. But so the judge, district court judge, essentially invalidated the two votes that were taken in early last year in 2020, and then the city is now appealing that decision to the Court of Appeals, and we expect that hearing will happen probably in July, and then depending what happens there, we anticipate that's probably going to get appealed to whatever decision happens, someone's going to appeal it. That will ultimately be a Supreme Court decision, probably not till even next year, depending on what their schedule is like. You make an interesting point with the homeowners as well. And again, it goes back down to the complexity of the situation. So there are 13 departments that oversee, quote, the development process. And those departments are actually spread out between several city managers, as opposed to having one person in charge of, quote, the entire development process. And each of them has their own competing goal. And they very rarely, if at all, talk to each other. In fact, so many of the meetings that we're stuck in is literally just trying to get the departments to talk to each other. One of I would say the worst ones is Austin Transportation Department. And, we're trying to work with them right now, ironically, with our members, and then private utility providers, whether you're Google or your Time Warner Cable or AT&T, you're just trying to share the right of way. No one has ever thought to have a conversation about how do we share the right of way. And so, those are the challenges that we have. And for the average homeowner, they see that even at their level where, Austin Energy is like, well, you need to do this. And Austin Water comes in like, well, you need to do this, but it's somehow in violation of what that other person has. And so, it's the complexity. No one talks to each other, and it's a really tedious process.
Well, that sounds like something that a performance audit of the city of Austin would be able to identify and address. And I hope that the Austin City Council would reconsider kind of their hesitancy to do that performance audit, because they have a budget of $4.2 billion. Actually, I think it's closer to $4.3 billion now. And we want to make sure that we're getting a good return on our investment. And they should want to make sure, as stewards of our money, that they are providing the best services for the best price. So we do have, for those of you who have questions, we have several questions coming in. So please just drop those in the chat and we'll get to those in just a minute. James, I want to go to you. Can you talk to us a little bit? One thing that we haven't touched on that I'm personally a little bit scared about is the debt in the city of Austin. It seems like we're constantly passing bonds plus, and that is kind of adding to our property tax burden. And we are also constantly passing certificates of obligation, which is non-voter approved debt, which is a way for the city council to say, well, or the county commissioners to say, well, we're going to do this project anyway, and we're not going to go to the voters for approval. Where do we stand as far as kind of our debt rating, and how is that impacting us and our families and our pocketbooks?
Great question, Ellen. And real quick, I hope Geoffrey doesn't get in trouble with our audience, because a few minutes ago he accused the city of Austin of establishing arbitrary measures not based on science. A hugely controversial statement. So, but I can tell you the city of Austin is deep in debt. And one of the problems that we have when it comes to public debt is the voters. I believe there's a problem of uninformed voters, and I think that was particularly pronounced during this last November cycle. Of course, there was a big proposition that went before voters, not necessarily dealing with debt, but it was actually dealing with city taxation. And one of the things that, what the city wanted was effectively a 25% increase in the city's tax bills, with an 8.75 cent per $100 of value increase. So it would cost the average homeowner about $400. And unfortunately, when that proposition was put before voters, there was no information on the ballot itself detailing what that would do to the average person's tax bill. And you see that pattern of tax increase elections and bond propositions going before voters without, I think, the requisite information. And if you look back just a couple of years ago, the city of Austin again put forward a $925 million bond prop that was approved by voters. And so what I think is happening is voters, even though they're taxed out, they see these measures and they think, you know what, I want my community to have good schools, good roads, all the necessary things that they need, not necessarily realizing that there is a tax link with what they're voting on. So one thing that we're asking the legislature to do this session is to require every local government to include on the ballot itself a number. Every voter ought to know the cost associated with a tax increase proposition or a bond proposition, especially in this heightened tax environment where we're all struggling to make it. And I think that would go far to really assuage some of the concerns that we have, as well as perhaps maybe get voters to think, is now the right time for a 25% city tax increase or $1 billion in new debt. Having information in the voting booth is so critical to, I think, our future prosperity.
So on the actual ballot, instead of having the point whatever cent per $100 valuation, which nobody really understands or wants to do the math when they're in the voting booth, it would allow or require them to say, for an average home price of $300,000, this is going to add $400 to your tax bill. Is that what that bill would do?
Right. So it's one point of reference. Right now, when you as a voter go to say yes or no on a bond proposition, you're really given two pieces of information: the principal amount that the government wants to borrow and a short paragraph of legalese. And as you very much alluded to right now, oftentimes that is confusing and doesn't necessarily make sense to the average person. So what we're asking for is just one definite number to show people what is the annual cost of this proposition if it passes. I think having that cost element is so critical to people understanding that there is a fiscal impact here. There is no such thing as a free lunch.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that actually segues perfectly into one of our questions from the audience, which is, are there any state level solutions that should be pursued in order to alleviate the excessive cost of living in Austin? So we've touched on two so far. You are more than welcome to expand on the audit idea, but that's something that I would really, really love to see the state legislature adopt. And then the one that you just mentioned, of course, which is kind of giving people a better understanding of what these bond propositions actually, how they actually impact their pocketbook. Do you want to give any more details either on the audit or expand on other legislative solutions that might be pursued this session?
Absolutely. So for anybody who may not be familiar with the efficiency audit concept, basically what we're encouraging folks to do, governments to do, is to bring in an independent auditor so that they can look at the books. We want to know, is the government spending money well? And for those instances where it's not, how can it be done better? Or does it need to be done at all? And so a few years ago, there was actually a proposition put forward that unfortunately voters turned down. I still think it's a good idea, and I still think the city of Austin should do it voluntarily. But we are taking that same concept and we're asking the legislature to apply it to all large cities and all large counties. Now, you may be wondering why. Well, I think there's a good reason when it comes to taxes, but I also think there's a good reason when it comes to federal aid, because a lot of these jurisdictions are being flooded with federal money now. And when it goes away, I think there's the threat of a tax increase in the future, because those jurisdictions are going to want to keep doing what they're doing. And so I think it's important to get our house in order now, and again, require every large city and every large county to undergo a third-party efficiency audit so that we can get a sense of where they're doing well and where they're doing poorly. And one other quick policy solution, Ellen. So, you know, when I talk about the tax issue, ultimately what's driving the problem is spending. I think the government spends too much, and I think we can do a better job on spending. So one final solution that we're asking the legislature to consider is a local spending limit. Now, before anyone freaks out, just know the state already has a spending limit in place. So what we're asking for isn't all that much different from what the state government is already doing. And if you apply this expenditure limit across, you know, your major cities and counties, I think you will begin to see some easing on the tax burden side of things. As spending necessarily slows down, so too will taxes.
Yeah, well, I am excited to be a part of your efforts going into the Texas legislative session, and it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds and how the city of Austin responds. But it sounds like the things that the Texas Public Policy Foundation is pursuing could really, really benefit and really, really impact lowering our cost of living in Austin. So, and another question that we have that I think maybe Jeff Tucker, you might be the best one to answer, and you may have already answered it in kind of your answer of supply, just build more supply. But the question is, how might surrounding cities and counties prepare for the rapid growth of Austin so that they don't experience some of the same problems that we're seeing today? And of course, similar to other cities, the surrounding suburbs tend to have a lot of the workforce. You know, people are commuting into downtown Austin, but also have their own kind of smaller city centers in and of themselves. They tend to have fewer restrictions, I would say, fewer government restrictions that put in place by the city. So a little bit easier to build there, but you know, they're looking over at the people who are getting pushed out of Austin and saying, well, we don't want the same thing to happen here. What are the solutions, or do you have any other advice for those surrounding communities and the leaders there?
Yeah, preparing for growth, you know, the best time, so the best time to build for a growing population is right as they're arriving or right before it. So looking around, you know, looking at how land is zoned in your city, zoning for some growth, zoning for a mix of different levels of density now, instead of just sort of looking around saying, well, it's farmland. And then, you know, maybe if a developer comes along, we'll subdivide, we'll do a particular sort of just greenfield subdivision. But trying to get ahead and think, okay, well, if we bring in that many, if we're going to permit that many homes, where's the school going to go? So another big part of this for city planning really is actually trying to get ahead of setting aside land and sites for things like schools, churches, all these kinds of uses that are actually very hard to retrofit into neighborhoods once they've been platted out. It's very expensive. My wife is an appraiser, and whenever they find one of these sites like a school or a church that's embedded in this otherwise residential fabric, it's like worth its weight in gold. It's so rare because, you know, once the growth comes, trying to rejigger on top of neighborhoods where people are living is much more disruptive, and you run into much more resistance to any kind of change, even if it seems like it should be a nice thing. We want to add a playground over here. We want to add a school because the other one's too crowded. Well, nobody wants all those cars dropping off their kids, you know, right next door. So trying to get ahead of that, and then that way when people move in, they say, okay, I'm moving in next to a school or next to this site that's marked as a future school. So any of those steps where you can try to kind of plan in advance, and again, try to set up sites that, you know, think about where townhomes could go, where small lots could go, anything that could sort of provide a range of ultimately prices. You can't set the prices, but we know how, you know, demand is going to kind of sift out. And then hopefully that way you can still provide workforce housing, family housing, young singles. Like there's a lot of different sort of needs from housing. So just planning in advance can help.
That's such great advice. And I think that the city of Austin would have avoided a lot of the issues that we're seeing with the land development code now if they had thought, you know, 10 years in advance. So for those of you in the surrounding jurisdictions, you know, get in touch with your city council members, or better yet, consider running for city council so that you can be making those decisions and planning your community success for the future. James, we just have a few minutes left, but I do want to circle back with you with one other question. A viewer is asking, how does the tax rate increase of Austin compare to other Texas cities like Houston or Dallas? What do you see there? How do we compare ourselves to other cities?
So in Austin, what we found is that the tax rate has largely stayed steady. In fact, I believe there was a rather sizable increase in this fiscal year's tax rate, but much of that was attributable to voters. By and large, I think the tax rate itself has stayed steady. Now, what you have to counterbalance that with is the fact that appraisals have increased in a very substantial way. And so the fact that the tax rate has stayed steady is not an accomplishment. In fact, it tells you a lot. That tax rate should be going down as appraisals go up. And so, you know, of course, you know, the city itself is just one part of the overall problem. If you look across the different jurisdictions, only one of the 5 major jurisdictions in Austin decreased their tax rate this fiscal year. That was only Austin ISD, and that was only because basically the state compressed the rates. Everyone else either increased in a very small way or stayed stagnant. And so, at least in the Austin area, I don't feel like we've done a good job of managing our tax rates, which by the way, your local governing bodies have a lot of discretion over those rates. And so, you know, I know we can they oftentimes cast a lot of blame at the state for increasing property taxes, but when it comes to the tax rates themselves, those are determined by your local elected officials. And so, you know, those have enormous influence on the size of your tax bill. I think the problem extends to many of your other major metropolitan areas, though. You haven't seen tax rates come down in a meaningful way, really anywhere in the major cities.
And I'm guessing that's such a good point about the appraisals and the tax rate, because a lot of people blame their rise in taxes on their rise in appraisals. And that's actually not the case. It's truly the tax rate, the people who have the ability to say what percentage of your value is, how much that is what really affects what you're paying to the government, not necessarily your appraisal. And you're exactly right that those rates are supposed to come down as the appraisals go up, because that means that the city is bringing in the same amount of money because they have so much more value. But unfortunately, we don't see that happening. And I'm going to go out on a limb, just since they asked specifically about Houston and Dallas, and say that the increase in the actual tax burden is likely much more significant in Austin than it has been in Dallas or Houston over the past decade or so. You think that's accurate?
I do, and I don't have that information on hand, but I can direct our audience to the Texas Controller's Tax Rates and Levies website. I promise it's not as bad as it sounds. In fact, they actually have a visual aid that will allow you to call up most of your cities, counties, and school districts and actually see not only what the tax levy is, how much they're sucking out of the economy, but also what the rates have been over a 5-year period. So you can do a lot of investigation on your own using the Texas Controller's Tax Rates and Levy tool.
Well, thanks, James. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, and I think you might be the right person to answer it. So get ready. Along with being more efficient on spending, what should the city consider taxing big tech companies that are moving to Austin to alleviate the rising cost for individuals and families? What do you think?
Great question. So I think there's a couple of answers there. One is, I don't believe any of these incoming businesses should be receiving special treatment. That is, I don't necessarily support the city, the county, or the school district offering tax abatement type deals or other special economic development programs and giveaways to these incoming businesses. Really what we ought to be doing is creating a welcoming environment by keeping our tax rate low and establishing some measure of predictability so that if a business comes in, they know what they're getting. So in that sense, I think we ought to be treating, some of our incoming big tech corporations in the same way that we treat everyone else.
Yeah, that's always a double-sided coin, right? It makes me think of like rent control in San Francisco. A lot of times you think, well, rent is rising, we got to do something about it. Well, hey, we'll put in place rent control. But what actually happens is that there's unintended consequences that impact people who aren't included in that special group. So I'm always wary of creating kind of special classes of taxing, special classes of people based on the amount of taxes that they pay and based on their circumstances. So overall, kind of the broadest tax base, ultimately those people are bringing in new tax base to our community, right? They're going to be hopefully building homes that are then going to be taxed and sending more money to the city to provide more resources. They're going to be spending money at the local stores, et cetera. So the broader the tax base that we can have, the lower our taxes are able to be across the board. But that only works is if we hold our local taxing jurisdictions accountable for the tax rates that they're setting. So I think that this was such a great and well-rounded discussion on all of the things that really impact our rising cost of living in Austin. Thank you to James Quintero from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Jeff Tucker from Zillow, and Geoffrey Tahuahua from RECA for offering your unique perspectives here. I'm sure that if anybody has additional questions, you can reach out to any of us individually. Again, I'm Ellen Troxclair. You can find me at the Texas Public Policy Foundation as well. Thank you for tuning in to Priced Out, Austin's growing affordability crisis. And hopefully with some of the ideas that have been proposed today, we can get a handle on the situation and not become the next San Francisco.